In this video, we're going to show you how to install front and rear disc brakes on a 4th generation Z28 Camaro.
Begin assembly of the rotor and hat using the supplied washers and bolts. Coat the bolts with red Loctite 271 and tighten snug in an alternating star pattern. Finish by tightening the bolts to 85 inch-pounds using an inch-pound torque wrench. Repeat this process for all 4 rotors and hats. If necessary, use a large breaker bar with the appropriate size socket to break the caliper bolts loose. Continue removing the bolts with a socket wrench. Once the bolts are removed, remove the caliper and set aside. Use side cutters to loosen the star washers and remove the rotor. Thoroughly clean the hub face with a wire brush. Prepare to mount the caliper bracket by applying thread locker to the caliper bolts and then slip the bolts through the factory caliper mounting ears. We'll start with 2 shims between the caliper bracket and spindle to center the caliper over the rotor. Tighten the caliper bolts until snug. Then tighten to 65 foot-pounds of torque using a foot-pound torque wrench. Because we're using 14-inch rotors, it's necessary to space the caliper higher up off the bracket using the supplied caliper spacer. We add 2 shims to each stud to adjust the overall caliper height. Remove the caliper hose bracket retaining clip. Disconnect the factory flex line from the chassis using a flare wrench. Connect the Wilwood braided stainless steel hose to the factory hardline using the supplied adapter. Reinstall the spring clip. Install the rotor and hat over the factory hub assembly and hold it in place with 3 lug nuts. Coat the caliper inlet fitting threads with Teflon tape and screw into the caliper. Slip the caliper onto the bracket over the rotor.
Check to make sure the caliper is centered and the height adjustment is correct. If not, then add or remove shims as necessary.
Secure the caliper with the provided washers and 12-point lock nuts. Tighten snug with a socket wrench and torque to 35 foot-pounds using a foot-pound torque wrench. Install the included BP10 brake pad, bridge bolt tube, and bridge bolt. Tighten the bridge bolt with an Allen wrench and an open end wrench. Connect the Wilwood braided stainless steel flex line to the caliper inlet fitting and tighten using a flare wrench. Loosen the lug nuts with an impact gun and remove the rear wheel. Use side cutters to remove the star washers. If necessary, use a breaker bar to loosen the caliper mounting bolts. Once loose, remove the bolts with a small socket wrench and remove the caliper. Remove the rotor from the axle assembly. Remove the spring clip that holds the brake line to the chassis and disconnect the factory flex line from the factory hard line. Connect the Wilwood braided stainless steel flex line to the factory hard line using the adapter fitting included in the kit. Secure the fitting to the bracket with the spring clip. Thoroughly clean the axle face with a wire brush. Apply blue Loctite to the factory caliper mounting bolts and slide the bolts into the caliper mounting bracket. Slide 2 shims onto the factory caliper bolts and install the caliper mounting bracket by screwing the bolts through the original mounting ears. Tighten the caliper mounting bracket bolts to 75 foot-pounds using a foot-pound torque wrench. Slip the 2 shims over the radial mount studs to locate the caliper's height over the rotor. Install the rotor and hat assembly over the axle face and tighten to the axle using 3 lug nuts. Coat the caliper inlet fitting threads with Teflon tape and screw into the caliper. Slip the caliper down over the radial mount studs on top of the rotor.
Check to make sure the caliper is centered and the height adjustment is correct. If not, then add or remove shims as necessary.
Secure the caliper with the provided washers and 12-point lock nuts. Use a socket wrench to tighten the nuts, and then torque to 35 foot-pounds using a foot-pound torque wrench. Connect Wilwood's braided stainless steel hose to the caliper fluid inlet. Tighten with the flare wrench to avoid distorting the fitting. Install the included BP10 brake pad, bridge bolt tube, and bridge bolt. Tighten the bridge bolt with an Allen wrench and an open end wrench.